RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Pro Athlete Supplementation. Check them out at pas-nutrition.co.uk for all your supplementation needs. And don't forget that subscribers to the Rugby Renegade program get a 40% discount on retail prices. Yes, this is episode 41 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. My name's Jamie Bain and today I interview Mark Bennett, Head of Sports Science and Medicine at the RFU. Benny, I worked with many years ago. He mentored me my first season in professional rugby, so I owe him a lot, but he's a great guy, really experienced. He's worked at international level and club level in Wales and England, wealth of experience. He's one of the first, if not the first, S&C coaches to bring block periodisation into rugby, and just a great wealth of knowledge. So, you know, put everything aside and give this podcast a good listen. Hi Mark, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Great to have you on. Why don't we just start by you telling us a bit about your background, how you got into strength and conditioning and some of the teams you've worked with.
Nice to be here, Jamie. Nice to catch up again, mate. I suppose start back at the beginning. I was really lucky when I retired from professional rugby, which I think was in 1999, to step into an S&C role straight away. Things were a little bit different back then. In reality, there was sort of only one person looking after the team, so there were no such things as interns, and it was a relatively young business, certainly in the UK and certainly in rugby. So I did a stint with Bristol Rugby there, which I think was maybe, I'm going to say that was 4 years long. They were quite successful during that period until the last season. I think we actually reached the first Premiership final and lost against Gloucester. After that, I moved back to Wales for family reasons and ended up looking after helping the WRU set up their academies at the time. They had funding from Europe, so I worked there with a good guy called Mostyn Richards, who worked for the WRU, and worked there, sort of working through the academies, putting them in place, getting S&C programs done, and also helping out a little bit with the national squad with Andrew Hoare, who was a big influence on my career actually. Then eventually, when he left, I took over the senior role there, and I worked with the national team through until 2009, which again, I think during my period at the WRU, I was lucky enough to be involved in 2 Grand Slams, and then moved down to the Ospreys. I was keen to move to the Ospreys for 2 reasons. One, I thought that I thought it was a great opportunity to be with a successful team at the time. I did think that they'd have an opportunity of winning Europe. They had a guy at head coach there, Scott Johnson, who I got on with personally, and I liked his outlook on the game. And also Andrew Hoare had taken over as chief operating officer or chief executive officer at the time, so I had good relationships with him. Stayed there through until, I'm not very good with dates, maybe 2009, maybe 4 seasons, so it might have been 2013, something like that, when I moved to Bristol Rugby and moved back to Bristol Rugby, and I've stayed there until last July, when I took up my current role with the RFU.
Yeah, awesome. Not a bad CV there, Benny. Now, you kind of, like you said, you started when, you know, the profession was, you know, in its infancy, and obviously a lot of, you know, you kind of developed, you know, as you went through, but you had a different background as well. Was it biomedical or biochemistry you studied before while you were playing as well? How do you think that's helped you in your career?
I thought it would help a lot more than it has, if I'm honest. But when I look back at it, actually, S&C, on the whole, unless you intend to go into research and you're really interested in the physiology, I think S&C is pretty much common sense, most of what you read.
Yeah.
I think probably the way we go in and the way that technology seems to be coming into the game. I think that you're probably better off now. Look, you need an S&C background now, don't get me wrong. There's some technical abilities and knowledge you require, but most of it is not into a high level in terms of biochemistry or those needs. It's relatively easy to learn, but I think these days it's more about understanding of technology and maybe some basic maths to help you get through.
Yeah, because I know you're quite big on stats and looking at kind of key performance indicators, but do you think that's the way things are going, or do you still think obviously the basics are important, but what are your thoughts on that?
Look, the basics are really important, and at the end of the day, you need to have the ability to put a good S&C program in place and a basic program that works the basic attributes of the sport that you're in. You have to have a realization and a knowledge of how to put together effective strength programs, how to put effective power programs, how to develop physiological abilities like, aerobic power, aerobic endurance. You have to have the ability to do these things, and they come first. And despite my earlier comments about technology, I do think technology will have an influence. But I do think that you should have the ability to put together a good program without any technology. I mean, you can use Excel to help you pull spreadsheets together and help you do a bit of planning, but I think if you think hard about things and do things correctly, you can have the same impact without GPS, for instance, as you would with it. It just takes a little bit more thought and a little bit more common sense.
Yeah, definitely a good point there. And you mentioned a few physical qualities there, and it kind of brings me on to my next question is about, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're one of, if not the first people to use block periodisation in rugby. Do you want to just talk to us a bit about what it is and how you've applied it to rugby over the years?
Well, there are a number of definitions of block periodisation, aren't there? So I like to think that I use some form, or when I was hands-on, I used some form of Verkhoshansky's block methodologies. I'm not sure if he'd think they were his methodologies to look to them, but they were my uptake and understanding of how you put a plan together. So I think really people sometimes, the first protocol is people question why you'd want to use block periodisation. So for me, it seems that in rugby, where you have a need to train and develop a large range of physical abilities in a relatively small amount of time that's available in the week, it becomes almost impossible to stop a player who is any reasonable training age from doing any more than tread in water if you looked at some form of concurrent training program. So I came to the conclusion that one of the things that I liked about block periodisation was that it gave me an opportunity to have enough time set aside in a week to focus on one or two elements of physiology or conditioning, and actually have the ability to perform enough volume to develop those the said attributes. Now, some people are quite critical of it, and they say, well, you spend too long away from other factors, you lose other attributes. So it's generally not the case, because you tend to be churning through blocks relatively quickly, 2 or 3 weeks at a time. You do a lot of your other stimuli are provided within the actual sport-specific or rugby sessions. So I just felt that it was an opportunity to do something that where the organisation suited rugby as much as anything else. So probably quite at an opposite end of the spectrum to other people's viewpoints, possibly. Now, how I put it together was sort of the focus would start in strength sessions where you would have a block of maximal strength work where the focus would simply be on improving strength and have no concerns around explosive power or any other qualities. And during that period, any opportunities that you'd have to do energy system work or energy system physiology work outside of the gym would be spent on work around aerobic attributes, preferably aerobic endurance, and maybe start to go towards some aerobic power towards there. And in some of the jobs that I've been lucky enough to do, I've had very good relationships with coaches where they've understood this, and we've actually had the ability to plan training sessions or sport-specific rugby sessions where length of drills, the way the drills were designed, were actually put in place to develop the energy system requirements that went with the sort of periodization blocks that we were following. Following your maximum strength phase is just a basic explosive strength phase or power phase. I don't see too much differentiation in rugby because sometimes I think of things very simplistically, and if you throw a shot put, you basically have to have the ability to have explosive power to carry your body across a circle and throw a 7-kilogram object as far as you can. When you're playing rugby, you have to have the ability to carry or move your body very well, and then move objects that approximate the weight of your body. So, much of my time spent doing explosive strength or power work for rugby would be spent moving bars as quickly as possible that weigh approximately the same weight as a player. So maybe jump squats at body weight, power clean and jerks at body weight, bench presses for speed at body weight. So that type of work. And then the final block of work really would sit within sport-specific needs. So I think my definition of sport-specific again might be a little different than other people. So I'd be looking at improving stretch shortening cycle. I mean, we tend to run everywhere we go in the field, so I'd have a basic program of plyometrics which went from very low level standing jumps for young players and players with low training age, when they eventually get to the point where they would be doing sets of depth jumps. So a lot of the specific work would end up and focus around depth jumps where applicable, and energy system work during those periods would focus on sport-specific needs. So it will be game-type activities, it will be drills going at match speed, those type of things. So I don't think there's anything in there that's too different from what other people do. It's just that maybe I tend to arrange it slightly differently and not be too concerned about staying away from some physical qualities for 3 or 4 weeks at a time.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And like a while back, I saw you tweeted a kind of flow chart looking at, I guess, kind of a strength diagnosis approach. Can you remember the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Could you kind of explain that? Because I think that, again, going back to simple and basic, that's a really good way for young coaches to kind of figure out what an individual athlete needs to be focusing on at any one time.
So again, these would sort of follow the paradigms that Berkoshansky would have in place in terms of the order of events, which I think most people realise that if you do periodise, work has to be sequential, and the work that you do in a block, if done correctly, leads into the work in the next block or the next phase, whatever terminology you want to use. So I think that when we talk about an individual sport like rugby, it's obviously a collision-based sport, and generally, unless you have some extreme qualities or you're very talented, you have to be big enough to play the game. So a lot of focus is put on hypertrophy and developing muscle mass. So it seems to me that, I put together some, and I actually did this when I was at the WRU, and it was a sort of a academy development plan, which actually worked very well. And we looked at asking the question, is a player big enough? If they're not big enough, let's do some hypertrophy work, and let's have a little sort of testing mechanism to see how long they stay within that hypertrophy training phase. And I figured out, well, we could probably stay in that phase until we start to lose some of our explosive power, or until we're big enough. So you'd have a sort of, the old flow charts I used to draw when I did computer studies back in school in 1984. We'd have a little flow chart where you have an input. Are you big enough? Yes. Well, you can move on to the next phase. No, hypertrophy program. How long do you stay in the hypertrophy block? And it would be, well, we made a decision. You stay in the hypertrophy block until your vertical jump decreased by more than 5%, or your muscle mass or size was where we wanted it to be. So we sort of keep on circling that little loop, or come out of the loop again, and go and do an explosive phase if you weren't big enough until you got your vertical jump back, and then you'd step back into it. And then we go into the next phase, and we'd ask yourself, well, are you strong enough? And we'd have a similar sort of little route that how long could we stay in a strength training system, and we keep with inputs and outputs. You have to forgive me, I can't quite remember what they are offhand. It's been a long time since I looked at it. And then you'd move on to a speed type block, and we'd ask questions around stretch shortening cycle. Do you have an explosive strength deficit was another. There was a nice little definition that we used to use, which came from the science of practice of strength training by Zatsayovsky. And if I remember rightly, I think it was, could you produce 50% of your maximum force within 0.1 seconds? So we'd make a decision in our, I think that was in our maximal strength block actually. So when you're going to do your maximal strength block, can you produce 50% of your force within 0.1 seconds? If yes, then you can keep on working maximal strength. If no, then you need to work on explosive strength, and we keep circling that loop, and then we come into the one where is your stretch shortening cycle or your stretch shortening cycle jump or counter movement jump greater than your squat jump, and then we'd have a little plan based on the outcomes of that. Do you need to do plyometric work, or just do you need to do simple explosive work? And then I think our last little block of work would be based around endurance or speed qualities, and we'd simply ask the question. We used to do a test back then called the phosphate decrement test, and I think it was 10 40-meter sprints run every 25 seconds, and the expectations were that at least one of your sprints would be at 95% of your maximum velocity, and you had to try and maintain all of your sprints to a point where your maximum drop-off was no more than 10% between your best and worst sprint. And we had a little rule there that if a player was able to maintain a 90% drop-off, then we'd work on maximal velocity. If a player couldn't attain or maintain 90% drop-off, we'd sit back in and do some endurance work, and then when he could do that, we'd start at the back end of the block again, and hopefully what we'd have at the outcome is a player who's worked quite specifically all the way through. He's done some strength work or some hypertrophy work to start with. He's then gone into a strength training block that either focused on maximum strength or explosive strength, depending on his percentages of force that he can produce at 0.1 seconds. Our next block would then look at developing power and what the players need to do that via plyometrics or other methods. And then finally we'd have a block of work where we focus on either speed or endurance, and we keep on circling that. And And the players who came out of that system actually did quite well. A lot of them are still playing for Wales.
Yeah, I just think it's a brilliant way to kind of organise, like say, do the strength diagnosis. It's all based on, you know, those standards, and you can adjust it better to the individual and see them improving over time as they go through multiple blocks. That's really, really good. Now, I know you've used kind of circuits in the past to develop different physical qualities. I think sometimes circuit training gets a bit of a bad rap. Sometimes people go, you know, if they don't understand the kind of thinking behind it, they kind of think circuit training is an old school approach. But could you just talk about how you set up circuits for different training or for different physical qualities to get the benefits out of them?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of points here. There's a guy who works for British Judo called Alan McDonald who writes some good stuff on circuits, and he's always worth listening to or reading about. And I do like some of the stuff that he says about it as well. But my thought process behind it are number one, I think that early in the year or in pre-season, when players are doing a lot of strength training and you're trying to get extra volume in terms of aerobic endurance and aerobic power, and you're not close to the season and you're not too worried about specificity, you can do work like rowing, like ski erg, and you can get some very good central adaptations in terms of your heart development, your blood volume, those types of things. You can get some very good central developments from utilising that type of work. As you get closer to the season and you're doing your strength training, there are 2 points that I noted from Verkhoshansky's work. Number one was that he spoke about specific strength training as being the ability to utilise your stretch shortening cycle if necessary, or not. So a lot of your specific work will be based around that. But then the second point he'd make is that it's great being able to be very strong or very powerful in the gym, but generally in competitive sports or team sports like rugby union, you're very rarely fresh and raring to go and recovered when you have to utilise explosive power, maximum strength, whichever quality you want to talk about. So these things need to be produced under aerobic fatigue. So I figured that during my specific training blocks, I could pull together circuits that were based on being very explosive, or as explosive as possible, and that may have some transfer towards the sport. And I felt that, I know it's very difficult to stay explosive when you have peripheral fatigue, but what you can do to a certain extent is alternate the type of work you're doing. So you can go from, total body work to upper body work, to lower body work, back to upper body work, and you can put together some quite specific, and when I say specific, they're specific only in the term that you're producing maximum force or maximum power output whilst under central fatigue or high heart rates, whatever you want to term it. So I don't know, we come up with circuits that might look something like power cleans into explosive bench press, into explosive rows, into a sled tow, into some form of squat jump, into a clapping press, throwing bags, etc. And they were very early, but I did think that they were very effective, and players bought into them, which is always important as well, and could understand why they were doing them and what they were doing them. And I thought they were very effective, especially for forwards. And you can obviously make these. We used to make them a little bit different for backs, where you maybe have slightly longer recoveries, and the explosive exercises you're using might be based more around agility runs, sled tows, and plyometric exercises. But we certainly got good results in terms of improved performance from players from doing that type of work.
Yeah, I think they're a great tool. I've still nicked some of your sessions from the Ospreys many years ago that I still use now. This is a question we ask all the guests on the podcast. Is what do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
I think that having a realization that quality isn't important. So, but the nature of the people that play rugby union, and I presume rugby league, means that the vast majority of them enjoy hard work, and they don't feel any sense of achievement or progress if they haven't worked hard and they're lying on their back and their legs aren't full of lactic, and an understanding that actually doing the impact that quality work can have on your ability to play. So be that, I don't know, instead of doing 5 sets of 5 power cleans, doing 10 sets of 2 at the same rate. Or instead of doing aerobic endurance work, spending some time doing quality speed work. And I mean speed work, not sort of sprint 30 meters, jog back, but actually focusing on quality, because I think it's important to realize that despite having requirements, despite having needs and abilities to work hard and to be able to work for 80 minutes at high heart rates, what does tend to separate the best players and the best teams from those who aren't so good are still explosive strength qualities. So it's still the ability to accelerate, it's still the ability to change direction, it's still the ability to jump high. These are all the things that when we look at strength diagnostics, these are qualities that are separating the good from not so good. So the best wingers will be more explosive than the not so good wingers. The best props will be not more explosive than the not so good props. And there's a tendency to think that you can work hard to make up for those attributes, but I think that people need to realise, or people will be far better spending time trying to improve, baseline speed, baseline acceleration, baseline power outputs.
Yeah, definitely. Now, tell us a bit about your role now, the RFU. Obviously, you oversee the whole pathway. So, how do you kind of approach that in trying to improve the kind of future talent of the England players?
So it's difficult. It's about having the right people in place. So I'm lucky to have some. I have a good guy looking after the 7s team, Dan Howells. I've got Robin and Grant with the 18s and 20s. We've got good strength and conditioning staff throughout the pathway. So my focus is being a little bit more about where do we sit. So for instance, where do the 20s currently sit in terms of the senior squad, in terms of their training intensities, their training volumes, what physical qualities the senior squad are looking for, and how can we pull the 20s towards the seniors. Then I think we're sort of getting quite far into that process at the moment, and it's about doing the same with the 18s. How can we pull the 18s towards the 20s? I think it's important, one, because we're a pathway, and at the end of the day, we have to produce players for England. So whatever England's needs are, we should be trying to mirror those in our development and maximise the physical attributes and the training attributes that they want. But it's also quite important in terms of players changing between teams. So it's quite possible that a 20s player can get called up into a campaign, and he has to be able to withstand the training volumes, intensities, high-speed running, etc., that we know the senior squad do. So having minimum abilities and trying to pull players towards that is quite critical in terms of robustness, as well in terms of a performance pathway. Now, the other area I think that's quite important that we're not good at in rugby is understanding the game and understanding what wins, what loses rugby matches. and what actions are actually critical on the field, for want of a better word. So when you win a game, is it because you scrum or line-outs better? Is it because you're kicking games better? Is it because you carry better? And I know there's going to be a degree of variance depending on the team, but you'd be surprised how similar those factors are between teams and between leagues. And how can we identify So I think the secret to team sports would be, or the future for team sports possibly, is identifying those critical factors or critical attributes that the best players and the best teams possess, and then investigating whether you can identify the physical or physiological components that support those on-field actions, and probably more importantly, if you can identify them and if you can develop them, do they actually produce better results on field? So do they cause an improvement in the critical actions that teams perform during games?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure I look forward to sort of hearing your, how that develops over time. It's really interesting. And again, another question we ask all the guests is, what advice would you give to upcoming strength coaches?
Look, I think number one, focus on the basics. It's really important. So, the number of times that I see a program that I have, when I read it, I don't actually understand what the outcomes that program is meant to generate actually are. So lots of gym programs look the same, irrespective of what people are trying to do. Lots of S&C or lots of on-field energy system programs look the same, as irrespective of where teams are or what time of the year it is. I think it's really important to realise that with the advent of GPS, it gives us lots of interesting information, but it's also led to this, in inverted commas, I'm making these air quotes here, where it's also led to people wanting to train like the game. Well, we train like the game every time we do a rugby session. So when we do our work off field, it's only general, and it's really important that we're actually doing what we say we're doing. So our sessions should do what they say on the can. So if we perform in a strength training session, know how to program to perform maximum strength or to improve maximum strength. Know how to program to improve explosive power. Know how to program to improve aerobic endurance, aerobic power, all of these things. So the sport-specific needs are not as important in team sports, or they are as important, but they're supported by general abilities. You have to be able to get players strong. You have to be able to get players aerobically fit. You have to be able to get players faster. So understand basic conditioning principles, and don't worry too much about specificity. I think that would be my first bit of advice. My second bit of advice, I suppose, is understand the sport that you're working in. And when I say understand the sport you're working in, I don't only mean the energetics and the physiology behind it. I mean the culture. I mean the type of people that you're dealing with, and how to develop relationships with those people. Because we all know that the best program in the world followed without buy-in is not as good as the worst program in the world followed with buy-in. So as well as having the ability to write good programs, you have to have the ability to ensure that players want to follow them and be motivated to follow them. And I think if there's one third bit of advice I'd have, it is that it's not critical, but I do think it's important that you look after yourself. And I have to be careful what I say here, but I think if you want to be a good S&C coach, you have to a certain extent, look the part. You have to look after yourself physically, and you have to be able to do some of the things you expect the players to do. You don't have to be as good as them at it, It doesn't have to be the same thing, but I don't think you can be unhealthy and overweight and expect the players to have a great deal of buy-in off you. I think you have to look after yourself. If I want to learn about computing, I'm going to go to somebody who understands computer science and practices computer science. You know, if I want to learn about S&C, I probably want to go to somebody who understands S&C, practices S&C, and understands the importance of looking after themselves, and also in such a stressful industry, probably important for your health as well.
Yeah, definitely some great points there, Benny. Thanks for those. And lastly, because I know you're a busy man, so where can people learn more about you?
Gosh, I'm on Twitter. I used to post quite a lot. I don't get too many opportunities now, but I tend to have a look. I think it's great for following some of the... it's great for picking up a lot of journal articles, and it's great for following what other people are doing. So I tend to be on Twitter. Probably nowhere else, if I'm honest.
Yeah, cool. Well, we'll share a link to your Twitter thing in the show notes. But Benny, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Some great information there. So I'm sure the listeners will get a ton out of that. But just thanks and all the best for everything for the future.
Cheers, Jamie.
Thanks, mate.
Nice to speak to you.
Right, so another great podcast. Thanks, Benny, for taking the time to speak to us. Tons of information there, whether you just want to improve your own performance or whether you're working with athletes and want to improve theirs. I think big takeaway is, focus on things that are actually going to improve performance. Don't get sidetracked by anything fancy, and make sure your training program is designed to improve that, not trying to hit everything at the same time. So great information. Thanks again, Benny. In the meantime, guys, please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn or iTunes, and give us a 5-star review, and keep checking us out at rugbyrenegade.com.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.